not drink alcohol now
You've
at
been
all.
thinking about Nazarites because you decided not to drink alcohol?
Yes, and well, like, because that's those are the only people who are so crazy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, them and conservative Pentecostals. So
Yeah, well, those are the only biblical example.
conservative Pentecostals and
Yeah,
Nazarites.
yeah, yeah. The the conservative Pentecostals from Pentecost, because the people were like they're drunk with wine, and they're like, no, they're
And
just
oh,
it's too
it
early for that.
it all makes sense. I don't think even modern day Pentecostals understand. Because that whole interaction, was that written, or it was just I thought that it said that people thought them drunk on wine, but they obviously weren't.
Yeah, they people thought they were drunk on wine, and then Peter said, "No, it is only the ninth hour." Or
Oh,
there are, I guess, a couple interpretations of that. The most straightforward and um, least creative interpretation is that it's too early. Some other
totally.
uh,
Yeah,
another
but I feel like that would mainly just be like Peter's using that as evidence for, of course, they're not drunk. But it sort of, to me, makes sense why conservative Pentecostals from Ukraine are very against alcohol because there's of course the modern day aspect to it where Eastern Europe is very into alcohol, since at least the Soviet Union, maybe before, because it's a very cold place, and also Soviet Union was a very cold government. But also, just like if you're going to be a sect of people whose main thing is sounding like you're drunk, then it would be probably very beneficial for nobody for people in that movement to stay away from alcohol because then nobody can make a complaint or try to fabricate some story.
mm-hmm.
But I'm not a Pentecostal, but I still think that it's like, um for me, I just feel better not having it. And um we'll
Not
see.
having alcohol.
Yeah, yeah, because like, I mean, I really like was pretty firm. I was like, ah, man, like with myself, I'm like, man, how am I gonna do Passover without wine? And and it's like, well, I guess I'll just have to stick to grape juice. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So that's the main difficult thing is Passover. But um,
Yeah.
I don't need it any other time of the year. I mean, I don't think there's any other celebration that you have to drink wine, um,
Well,
for a wedding.
Passover's the obvious one.
Uh-huh.
I can't really think of any others at the moment either.
A
So.
wedding champagne. It's pretty hard to separate those, but not in European weddings. So
Mm-hmm.
there's non-alcoholic champagne. So
Mm,
here's
that's
also
true.
my we should get started, but here's also my thought process is, um, basically if you can be as entertaining or have as good of an environment without alcohol, um, uh, then I just think that would be better because it's like, why? Because otherwise you're relying on something that's not God, you know. And I think that that's largely the way that it's used in our society because that's the way I used it.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Um, I think it really just depends on what you're using it for, because
Uh-huh.
I think obviously being a drunkard is wrong.
Yeah.
That's what Scripture clearly says.
Hmm.
Um, Alcohol itself is not wrong, and
Yeah.
and so you have to find that like middle ground where you're not going in excess, being a glutton for alcohol or that sort of stuff,
Hmm.
and where you're not just, I mean, unless it's a particular temptation for you, where you're not cutting yourself off entirely.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of people, I think, misunderstand the Nazarites, and they cite the Nazarites as being like particularly holy.
Uh-huh.
And so, therefore, because they're particularly holy and because they are not allowed to drink wine, therefore, that is the sign of their holiness.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that's it. The
Well,
Nazarite,
it's by definition one of their signs because it's a distinction. But
right. Well, you know, holy in our vernacular is like interchangeable with good. But
since
um, the Nazarites, or to be a Nazarite, was the process by which a regular Israelite could do the things that the priests do.
Mhm.
And so all of the stuff that they were not allowed to touch, it was because they might be actually assisting in the temple,
Mhm.
like the Levites.
Yeah,
So a clear example of this would be Samuel, who, being an Ephraimite, was able to perform sacrifices and go all around and do the priestly sort of duties, and he was a
being an
Nazarite.
Ephraimite.
Yep, he was from the tribe of Ephraim, and he was given to the temple, and he was made a perpetual Nazarite.
Uh-huh.
So, to be a Nazarite is to become more priestly, and so the duties or the responsibilities of the priests are transferred to the Nazarite. So the priests don't drink alcohol when they're doing the temple service. Um, in fact, like you are, at least in Second Temple Judaism, you are a priest insofar as you are doing the temple service. You're not a priest at really any other times. You're a son of Aaron, and you have
Mhm.
the potential to be a priest, but you're not actually a priest until you're doing the temple service. So it's
Mm.
sort of one and the same there. And so to be a Nazarite is you don't drink alcohol because the priests don't drink alcohol. You don't touch dead bodies because the priests don't touch dead bodies. You don't cut your hair. Well, first you shave your head, and the priests shave their entire bodies before, as they're getting ordained, and then they let it grow. And I think the distinction there, and we'll get more into this as we do more research into scripture, into the laws regarding the priests, and the first mention of priests is in Exodus. So we're starting Exodus today.
Mhm.
But they, what was I going to say? Oh, I'm pretty sure they keep their hair trimmed, and that would be the only distinction.
Uh-huh.
But I could
The
be wrong.
Levites keep their hair trimmed.
The priests do,
Uh-huh.
but I could be
That's
wrong
that's
about that.
that's that's yeah, that's interesting because like when I was talking to this Cohen on the airplane in 2018 on the way to Israel, it's like he didn't like shave off completely the sideburn, but it seemed to be a style where they're like trimmed, like
Mm-hmm.
very trimmed. I don't want long hair again, so yeah, I can't be a Nazarite.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I'm gonna do a test here.
Oh, can you hear me when I?
No, you just muted yourself.
Okay, okay. Like
Okay,
instead of just
test succeeded, so we can continue. What were you saying?
have you figured out what's up with the um with when you record and you put it on YouTube, it's like all of them have just been showing the entire clip. It's not very cleaned up, you know.
Entire clip?
Yeah, let me go to YouTube right now. I could even show you to YouTube. Okay, yeah. Even last week's one, same thing. If you look at on YouTube, all of the last uh No, all of the last ones in the last month, one, two, three, four, five. The last five of them have all been it's not very clean of a cut. It's like showing the recording stuff, um, the background. I think it'd probably be good to fix that. Because like if you look on the video from a month ago where you did Genesis 37 and 38, um, the whole screen was the Bible, and that looked better. But then moving forward from that, you have half the Zoom screen, and it looks kind of
Yeah,
not
I've
very
been
good.
trying.
So I don't know. I don't know how we fix that. If I'm, I mean, I could record it on my computer and then upload it or something like that.
Well,
Or
if it works better for your
um,
computer, I've been.
no, it's not about how. Oh, it probably will work better for my computer. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. But then I just need to upload it. I don't know how much editing
Zero.
you do on these.
Yeah.
Zero. Okay, then yeah, I could do the uploading. Is it is it just your computer? Do you know what it is with your computer? Because it worked like the first time we did this, and then after that, it was just um, after the Christmas episodes, it
Hmm.
stopped sort of working, I think.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. What I have been trying to do is to um, have both the scripture and the participant video going on at the same time on the same screen. And
Uh-huh.
then of course I don't really
I'm
choose a
pretty.
thumbnail
Yeah.
whenever I upload it. So, is that what you're talking about?
Uh-huh. It's no, it's the full recording. Like, basically, okay. Let me exit out of this. I can go back to one of your older recordings. Okay. So, for example, says 1 month ago, Messianic Bible Study 17 on
Mm-hmm.
Genesis 34 and 36. Um, the that's a no, this has gotta have been an even better one because it stopped working around the Christmas episode. Let's see, okay, so the first one is there. Let's look at this video real quick. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so if you look at Genesis 29, the Messianic Bible Study 13 you did, that's that looks better. Basically, it's cleaner. There's not like all the recording stuff. It's from
Hmm.
yeah, 2 months ago.
I'll have to look at that after we're done today.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess next week I could start doing the video record just because I'm not
Yeah, sure.
already logged into all this stuff. So
Anyway, welcome to another
yeah.
episode of Messianic Bible Studies. We're recording, by the way, because I'm in a two-party consent state, but you're not. So
But I'm not.
today we're actually very excited to begin Exodus 1. So we're starting Exodus, and Michael is joining me today. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Anything you want to say to introduce?
No, I'm just like you said, very excited to get into Exodus. It's we're getting
Yeah,
into the
yeah,
good stuff.
exactly. Because Genesis is, it's okay, but Exodus. Mm.
It's okay. It's like a general outline, but now we're getting into the
Ooh, yeah,
chronological narratives.
proto history. So, as Genesis
Hmm.
was broken down into, it was generally largely a book of myths, and I talked about this in the first episode. A myth is not something that's wrong. A myth is a founding story, which has more or less historical accuracy. And so a lot of the stuff in Genesis, it's not history in that if you're writing a historical book, you typically share all of the relevant information, But if you study Genesis, and especially as we've been going through Genesis, it took 21 episodes to do that. There's information that you sort of have to piece together. And we've also talked a bit about the documentary hypothesis and how there is like the idea that there were multiple Genesises, and a redactor came in and sort of put them all together. So whether or not you believe it, it does lend to that sort of interpretation. So while Genesis was broken up into a series of myths, all starting from my opinion with the phrase, these are the generations of X, these are the generations of Jacob, of Abraham, of Noah, etc. Now we're starting in Exodus 1. And Exodus is a different genre. Exodus is more of a covenant text. And the reason that I say this is it actually follows decently the format of a Hittite suzerain treaty. And a Hittite suzerain vassal treaty was broken down into a series of sections, which there typically were like, I think, between 3 and 5 of these sections were in any part of a suzerain vassal treaty. And, they weren't all the same. And very few of these treaties from the ancient world actually have all of the sections of this format. But Exodus is broken down into this in general, in large part. And not only Exodus, but the entire Torah is. So Genesis, being a book of myths, can largely be put into the first category of the suzerain vassal treaty. And the first category is this is the suzerain. This is a suzerain, and typically, like, if you look at maybe the Code of Hammurabi, the suzerain introduces himself as the author of the treaty. So he's saying, I am Hammurabi, I am the son of this god, and given wisdom by this god, and I conquered you, and I'm giving you all of the wisdom of this law that I've received from the gods and stuff. Because God is the one who is our suzerain, he doesn't do that. He says, I am the one who created everything. And then, okay, so that's the introduction. Then you have the next section, which is, this is what I've done for you. Whether it is, I conquered you, which they wouldn't say that. They would say, I freed you from your tyrant, or something along those lines. But, they have this series of things that they've done for the vassal. So God, in Genesis, the entire book of Genesis, is basically that. I have freed you from your vassal. Or, I've freed you from Ur of the Chaldeans. I created you. I created the world. I did all this sort of stuff. In Exodus, we don't start with who God is. The different categories are reversed here. First, it introduces with sort of a historical narrative of what the predicament that the Israelites are in. What is that predicament? And it's the oppression of Egypt, the slavery that God foretold that they were going to be in. And so then, finally in Exodus 3, God reveals himself and says, I am this person. So the next section is typically, these are rules. These are the covenant guidelines. How do you stay in covenant with me? It's, you obey these rules. And it's not really like, so as Christians, we sort of reel from that in a little, we sort of reel from that a little bit, because we're like, well, it's all about faith, which is true, but we are part of a covenant. And so the suzerain comes in and he saves the people from something, and then they're in a covenant. It's not about anything that the vassal did per se. I mean, there oftentimes was something that the vassal did, but That's not a necessary component of this treaty. You can do nothing, and the suzerain comes in and says, I'm making a covenant with you. And that's more or less what God does. We maybe call upon him, we ask him for to come into our lives, we seek him out, but we don't do anything. The rules are about the covenant regulations. So you're in the covenant. Now this is how you live in the covenant. And so one of the things, especially as Messianics, when you look at the covenants from the perspective of the covenants, then things make a lot more sense. You're like, okay, well, we're not saved by works. Okay, that's true. Saving, to be saved, is the entrance into a covenant. Then why does Paul, why does Peter, why does Jesus all tell us to do things? And you're like, well, we're not saved by works, but they tell us to do things. So therefore, should we not do those things, or should we do those things? Well, the answer is we should, because those are the covenant regulations. We're in the covenant. We're not saved by these regulations, but once we're in the covenant, these regulations apply to us. And so that is the regulations are the next section. And then oftentimes there's a section of curses and blessings. If you break the covenant, this is what's going to happen. If you keep the covenant, this is what's going to happen. And the blessings is more like, because it's expected that you'll be doing the things that, like the regulations, the blessings are more just like default mode. The blessings are the default because you're expected to keep the covenant. The curses are there just to sort of warn you about what happens if you don't keep the covenant. And so we even get this in the new covenant. You can, whatever it is, whatever bad thing that happens to you for sinning, that's the curse. That is the curse. What about the blessing? You get to go to heaven. You get to be in relationship with God. You get to have a blessed life. Like, all these things are the blessings. And those are laid out in the New Testament. And then you'll have an epilogue. So another really interesting thing, and this is something that some Messianics, one person I'm thinking of is Yitzhak Shapiro. They have this idea of the two Torahs. And this idea is because oftentimes Torah and covenant is interchangeable, although it's not. And that's something, like if you see the law and you think that the law equals covenant, that's wrong. The law is a section of the covenant, but that's not the covenant. So that'll be important later when we get into the New Testament. But where was I?
You're saying some people like
the
Yitzhak
two
Shapiro
Torahs,
have this idea
and this is
too.
this idea that the first covenant actually came on Mount Sinai, with Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, coming down, giving it to them, and then all the way up until Exodus, let's say 30. That's the first covenant. And, the first covenant didn't have curses, it didn't have blessings, it was just a nice covenant. It stopped with the regulations, and there wasn't really a sin thing. Like, it was expected that you weren't going to sin, so God didn't really provide provisions for sin. And then later, what you get is, like, everyone was going to be a priest. All the firstborn were going to be priests. That was part of the first covenant. So it was like this broadened perspective. And then once the sin of the golden calf happens, then you have well, I'm going to preface this because oftentimes in this suzerain vassal treaty, there will not be a blessing and curse section in the original treaty. But if the vassal rebels, then the suzerain comes in, stamps out the rebellion, and then he can either just kill them all. That's one choice. Or the second choice is to place heavier burdens on them and introduce specific curses. And so people oftentimes see the curse section and these heavier regulations as part of that sort of reintroduction of the suzerain vassal treaty. So the second Torah, after the second Torah, then you get the Levitical priesthood, because the Levites, they're the ones that strapped on the swords, and they received the priesthood that day. And so at one time it was all the firstborn. Now it's just the Levites. At one time there wasn't going to be a physical tabernacle. He was going to dwell within us. But now there's a physical tabernacle. At one time there were not sacrifices because he just made us righteous. Now there are sacrifices and that sort of stuff. It's a very anti-ceremonial position, and it's wrong. And we'll get into that when we get to those sections. But
the idea of two Torahs is a very
typically,
anti-ceremonial one. Why is it? Is it because they are thinking they want to go
it's
back to the
because
first covenant,
when
or?
people talk about it, and this is why I say typically, whenever you get these like
Mm-hmm.
hyper parsings of scripture in this sort of way, it's always like you're trying to get, it's always like, okay, you have the tripartite view of the law, the moral, civil, and ceremonial. People are always trying to get rid of the ceremonial one
Mm-hmm.
and make that
Mm-hmm.
non-obligatory. And so it's always
Mm-hmm.
an anti-temple, anti-ceremonial, anti-priesthood sort of stuff, because you know God is within us, man, and He's in every single one of us, and we're all holy. So why? And Jesus is our only mediator. So why have a priesthood? And and so like
Mm-hmm.
that's typically how it
Okay.
goes. And then finally, so then you have the epilogue, and the epilogue is oftentimes, well, now I've brought you into your rest. This is what we are in full communion with each other, the suzerain and the vassal. And so Exodus is broken up in these sections. You do have blessings and curses. You do have regulations. You do have this epilogue where Moses and the people of Israel, they finally build the tabernacle and God dwells within it. Exodus is called Exodus because, at least in the Greek tradition, because it is all about the Exodus. God saves us from slavery. He takes us out into the wilderness, and then He dwells among us. Those are the parts in Exodus. And then there are some other things that happen within it. But you see how Genesis is largely a book of myths. Exodus is a book of the covenant. And it fits within the larger Torah, the entire Torah, which is itself structured in a suzerain vassal sort of treaty. And then you also have other covenants within it. So like when people talk about the first covenant or the second covenant, they're largely talking about the covenant on Mount Sinai. But like the first covenant is technically the one with Adam. Then you have a covenant with Noah. Then a covenant with Abraham. But when you talk about a first covenant, you're typically talking about the Sinaitic covenant. But you know, the covenant with Abraham, nobody says that one's done away with. The covenant with Noah, nobody says that one's done away with. It's always only the covenant on Sinai. And
Mm-hmm.
there's some merit to that, because that's the one that was bilateral. You enter into the covenant and you're supposed to live by it. And so that's the only one that we can actually break. The Abrahamic covenant, we can't break that. We have faith in God, we enter into a relationship with Him, and we can like not circumcise. That's the way to break that covenant, and you can be cut off from your people in that way. But God's the only one who passed through the pieces. And so the penalty which is typically death for breaking this covenant, is not there. It's God is the only one who bears the penalty for the breaking of that covenant. The Sinaitic covenant is bilateral by definition. because it's a suzerain vassal treaty. So, with
Mm.
that, I think that pretty much covers the genre, the theme, and the story of Exodus. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about the distinction between the Sinaitic and the Abrahamic covenant, there's
The covenant.
covenant, not
Covenant.
the covenant. It's like a combination
Mm,
between government and
imagine.
covenant. Um, when you talk about those two things and you say that God's the only one who can bear the burden for the Abrahamic covenant being broken, of course that's correct, but um, you also said that a person can't break the Abrahamic covenant because
Mm-hmm.
it's not bilateral. Um, so it's just God's promise to man. So I guess there's now, in my mind, a little bit of confusion, um, because the covenant that God's people broke was the Sinaitic covenant. So the only way to sort of rectify that, in my mind, is that these covenants build on top of each other. And so when the Abrahamic covenant came, it built on top of the Noahide the covenant that God made with Noah. And so everything that was required by Noah is now also required by Abraham, just, and it's just stuff that he's already naturally doing because the generations have done that. And then when the Mosaic covenant or the Sinaitic covenant comes, their responsibilities are built
Mm-hmm.
onto that. So the promises from the Abrahamic covenant, because the Torah
Mm-hmm.
relates them directly. That the reason he drew them out of Egypt was because they're the children of Abraham and they're under the Abrahamic covenant. So they compact onto each other, and so it's all inclusive. So I don't know that I would
Yeah,
separate them
no,
like
I
that.
agree with that. Um, One way to look at it is like the Pyramid of Giza, for instance. Specifically that one, because, or I guess any step pyramid. But the idea is you have, and this is how the first step pyramid, at least how we think the first step pyramid was produced. You have a temple that's built, and then it goes out of vogue. And then people are like, oh, there was a temple here. So they build another temple on top of it. And they do that across a few
Mm,
generations, and finally you get this pyramid structure. And the top one
mm,
is the one that is currently active, but it cannot exist without the other ones. And the other ones, although they are not
yeah.
active, they're still supporting the first one. And the first one is or the top one, and the top one is going to be based on the structure of the other ones. The Pyramid of Giza specifically is how we should think of the covenant, because it was all formed, it was all planned at once. All of it was planned at once.
Uh,
The new covenant was always part of the plan. And we know this because Jesus
yeah.
was, he was a sacrificial lamb put to death from the foundations of the world. So it was always part of the plan. And in the Pyramid of Giza, originally, it was, I think it was covered with uh, ivory. And then the very top was gold.
Mm,
And so the capstone, the pinnacle, being that would be the new covenant, is the part that's gold. That's the one you see, but it cannot exist without any of the other stuff, and the entire thing is one structure. So the old covenant and the new covenants are
mhm.
part of the same structure, and it's not like one goes out of vogue when the new one gets put on top of it. It's just that uh, there are certain relationships that change.
Mm. That's interesting. And my memory is failing me a little bit when I'm thinking about what was in the Noahide covenant and what were the requirements in Acts 15 for the new
Mm-hmm.
believers. Um, are they identical, or
It depends on
there's
how you
some
read Acts
differences?
15. Um, but I think one
Hmm.
of the basic things is Acts 15 is an entrance exam to the church,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
not a full list of things for Gentiles to keep. And
Uh-huh.
for instance, if you were to compare them side by side, so there are a couple interpretations of Acts 15. First, there's like the four-part laws: don't eat blood, don't drink blood, I should say, don't fornicate, don't do a couple other things. I forgot what they were, but
Things strangled and things sacrificed to idols,
yeah,
I believe, or
exactly.
polluted by
And
idols is the
that's three
terminology.
food laws, and also don't commit sexual
Uh-huh.
immorality. But
And that's
yeah,
an
yeah.
entire
But
section of the
then, okay,
Torah.
what about murder? It's okay to do that.
Uh-huh.
So some people they
No,
interpret
of course not.
the keep yourself from blood as don't murder. So then you would
Uh-huh.
have actually a three-part um, law code: don't murder, don't commit fornication, and don't commit idolatry. And this starts looking a lot more
Uh-huh.
like the rabbinic understanding of the highest laws, or the laws that you should not break under any circumstances, even if your life depended on it. Which,
Yeah.
murder, fornication, and idolatry. But if that's the case, then they don't look like the Noahide laws. Don't drink blood.
Hmm.
Don't drink
Oh
blood.
yeah,
That's a Noahide
you're
law.
right.
But don't commit idolatry. That's not really a Noahide law. Although Menachem Schneerson, he interprets one of the Noahide laws as don't commit idolatry. So I mean, it's kind of messy and muddy, but you can interpret it in a
Yeah.
Noahide law sort of fashion.
I had a thought that I was sort of parsing through, but that sort of answers that it's not exactly that. Because I was thinking about the pyramids and like the steps towards following God and how there's this first initial step. Just don't do this basic
Mm-hmm.
thing, but that kind of gets a monkey wrench gets thrown into that as soon as you read don't commit sexual immorality. That's like, okay, that's a really long list of things that you kind of have to already know the Torah to stay away from because I had someone ask me recently. It's like, what is the acceptable relation with like
Mm-hmm.
cousins, right? And so then you go to the Torah and like you have all these specific things, and you know, so it seems pretty basic to people today, I think.
Right. Well, we have typically more
But anyways,
stringent
that yeah,
rules in America regarding cousin marriage because in the Torah it prohibits the first
uh-huh,
cousins but not the second cousins. Um,
uh-huh,
I think actually in many states you can marry first cousins, but
yeah.
yeah.
So
Anyway,
that's interesting. Second cousins are legally allowed to marry
oh,
in every state. Yeah.
okay. Good to know.
So,
Good to know.
moving on before we get before we
Okay.
get too much into the weeds. All right.
Let's start with Exodus 1. Like we typically
All right.
do, 10 to 10. These are the names of the
All right.
sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now, now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us, and escape from the land.
Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all the matters of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the other's name was Puah. And he said, When ye do the offices of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill them. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and they are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them, or they delivered before the midwives came. Therefore God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive.
Okay. So the first thing we get are a recap, so to speak, of the last story, the epilogue of Genesis. We get in the prologue of Exodus. And I think this whole thing is essentially a prologue until we get to God's name. Um, so Joseph dies, and then all of that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, they multiplied, and all that sort of stuff. So the land was filled with them. And if you were to put this on, like, look at this from the perspectives of the Egyptians, all of them are slaves, except for the priestly caste and the king. So everyone's a slave in Egypt, except for these foreigners. And so that creates bitterness. Give it a couple generations, you forget what Joseph did for you. Not only the king of Egypt, but all the people of Egypt. They forget that Joseph was the one that saved them, and that they owe a strong debt to Joseph and his family. And now you grow up and you're under burden, and you're like, why am I a slave? Why are they not a slave? I'm an actual Egyptian, born, raised in Egypt. My family has been in Egypt for generations. They are foreigners. Why are they not slaves? And so, naturally, with that bitterness and resentment, you want to overthrow your oppressors, so to speak. And there's no real indication that Israel was oppressing them, but if you have that sort of mentality and you want to find some sort of reason to overthrow the structure, the civilized structure that you're born into, then you have to break it down into you are the put upon underclass and you're being oppressed by whoever is not put upon. And there's actually some interesting history, especially if you put the dating of this roughly at the end of the Second Intermediate Period and the beginning of the New Kingdom, because
What time period is that?
around 16, 15, 1400 BC, around those times. And what you get, because in the Second Intermediate Period, you have a series of Asiatic pharaohs in northern Egypt, or the Lower Kingdom, which is interesting because they're not Egyptians, they're foreigners that came in and then eventually rose in power and prominence and just basically replaced the pharaoh. But of course, during this period, you had two pharaohs, one in Upper Egypt and one in Lower Egypt, and the king in Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt finally brought his people together. He also he made war with the Ethiopians down south. Forgot what they were called. And then decides to make war with the Egyptians up north. And I'm pretty sure he was unsuccessful in his war with the Ethiopians. So it sets the stage for him to be fearful of being overpowered. And also, it's not only a different pharaoh, but it's a different lineage of pharaohs that comes in and invades northern Egypt, and they hate the Hyksos. Those are the people that were there at the time, the Asiatics. And there were all these negative feelings back and forth. There's a story of the king of the king of northern Egypt sending a letter to the pharaoh of southern Egypt saying that your hippos are too loud. You need to quiet them down. I'm trying to sleep. I can't sleep at night. And so the king of lower Egypt sends a letter back. Basically, it was like an FU, and then he attacks a village. And the king of upper Egypt was like, stop, I'm going to attack you. The king of lower Egypt says, do it. And the king of upper Egypt says, not now. It's sort of a bluff. And so the king of lower Egypt, or of upper Egypt, he seizes on that bluff and says, okay, well, I'm going to do a full-scale attack. So he full-scale attacks the king of lower Egypt, or northern Egypt, and sets himself in power. He gets rid of the lineage of the Asiatic pharaohs and sets himself up to rule both upper and lower Egypt. And this is the period of the New Kingdom. That's the beginning of the New Kingdom, the first dynasty. Or no, this would be the 12th, 18th dynasty? I don't remember. 16th, I believe. 16th dynasty. So, if you assume that this is happening around that time, then you have about 100 years or so, and then you get to the Exodus time period, where you would have like around 1500 BC, maybe 1540. The dates are a little off, and so that would be a complication for this. And also there is, decent, not really evidence, but most scholars put the Exodus later to like 1200 BC, because they build the cities of Ramses and Pithom and stuff like that. But that's just a name issue, and we've already had anachronisms in the Bible, so there's no real reason to take that seriously over the other circumstantial data of like what's actually happening, because this mass slavery didn't happen under Ramses. The killing of the sons, at least he didn't tell us that it happened. Ramses didn't just disappear, and all that sort of stuff. So we set the stage for, behold, the people of Israel, too many, let us deal wisely with them, unless they break out as our enemies do. Now, at this time, they hate each other. Upper and Lower Egypt hate each other. So it's not unnatural for the king of Upper Egypt to say, these people might actually join with our enemies that we just lost a battle to in order to finally destroy us. And so they invade the land of Lower Egypt and kill the Asiatic kings, and then set taskmasters over them to afflict them. So they put them into slavery and bondage. What this means is the people who were once a slave, they had some sort of revolution, at least in Lower Egypt, because during this second intermediate period, the two kingdoms were separated. We don't really know exactly what was happening in Upper Egypt from what the Bible says. But in Lower Egypt, we know that sort of stuff was happening. So Upper Egypt, he's like, Egyptians should be rulers in Egypt. So he goes up to Lower Egypt and says, Egyptians, why are you slaves? You should be rulers. And those Egyptians who are bitter and don't remember Joseph, they're like, you're right. Why are we slaves? We should be rulers. And so they join forces together and overthrow the Asiatics. So then Pharaoh had them build store cities, Pithom and Ramses. And if that is an anachronism, then basically they would build two different cities I forgot the names of, and then the redactor knowing that nobody knows what those cities are, they're like, oh, it is Pithom and Ramses, because those cities lasted
Mm.
quite a while. Pithom and Ramses did once they got renamed. But of course, the more that they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, which is very annoying if you're trying to oppress people and not have them multiply. And so the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, and they made them work as slaves and made their lives bitter and all that sort of stuff. Do you have anything to add before going to the next paragraph?
Yeah, so it's interesting reading this because this sort of in verse 6, going back to the calculation of how many people went into Egypt, it says, and Joseph died and
Verse
all his,
5.
sorry, verse 5. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. So, the loins of Jacob being Canaan. But Joseph also has his two sons and his wife. So that means 74. Okay, don't know about the last one. I'm just trying to calculate because in the
Yeah.
Septuagint how it says 75, and so I don't know if we include Joseph in that or if we not include him and his
Yeah,
two
it's
sons and his wife.
difficult.
But
His two sons and
uh,
wife they didn't come from Canaan, though. So,
uh-huh,
those,
yeah, okay. But his two sons were
that's true.
adopted
But
by
they still didn't come from
by
Canaan.
Jacob, and so oh man, yeah, okay. So I thought there
Yeah.
was something there. I guess there's not. I was reading the commentary by John MacArthur, and it seemed like he was saying something similar to you, basically that it's the 18th dynasty that was the 18th dynasty with Tutmosis the third, was the one who basically uh, turned the Israelites into captives. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to talk about, but whenever I hear people talk about it, it's always like something slightly
Yeah.
different from
Everyone
everybody
has their
else.
own
Um,
theory about, like, who was what and what happened during the Exodus, what prompted it, and all that sort of stuff. Um, Let me see here. I'm looking for Kings.
yeah, and so for me, it's sort of interesting, like how I mentioned at the beginning of this, we're getting more towards the, like chronological like story of Israel. Like we're getting closer to us basically. So it's more realistic sounding to us than Genesis, the story of Genesis might, because it's so
Mm-hmm.
much further in history. Um, and then eventually we're going to get to David, where we actually have mentions of his name in the archaeological record. David is an extremely important figure for the whole sort of messianic aspect of the Israelite religion, which
Mm-hmm.
of course I think that it should be the main aspect. And then just aside from that, another thing I wanted to mention is it's interesting that there's this large gap in time between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, similar to how there's a large gap in time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. There's like a 200, 300 year separation between the events, I believe, of the New Testament and the last
Mm-hmm.
book, which was Daniel. So that's why this is like, a very key point for us to be transitioning into, because Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are all sort of together chronologically, and it's separated by like 300 or 400 years from the end of
Yeah,
Genesis.
but there are books in between. So, um, the Old Testament is,
Oh, okay.
you largely have, like, not really a year for year account, but almost every year in the Old Testament are accounted for, except there might be gaps between the years that are accounted for. But we just don't know if or how long those gaps are. So it's different.
Well, I mean, but we don't have that for the period between Genesis and Exodus, right?
We do. We just read it. Jacob and his household, they moved into Egypt, and these are the descendants of Jacob and that sort of stuff.
I know, but we pick up with Moses,
We
who's
do,
a
though.
son of the tribe of
In
Levi, who's born.
in the
Okay.
end of Genesis, it gives us a series of names all the way down to Moses' father. So
Uh-huh.
Moses is,
Oh,
if I
okay.
remember
Okay.
right, the fourth or fifth generation from Jacob or from Levi,
Hmm.
one of those.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but it doesn't give us an account. It gives
True,
us
true.
generations,
We
which,
don't we don't know
there's
much between the times when Joseph died and all this stuff happened because there could have been like 100 or so years between those two events.
right, and it's that's why it's very akin to the transition between the Old Testament and the New
I see what
Testament
you're saying.
accounts
Yeah.
because because we have the generations all the way from David to Jesus. We have the two genealogies, but we still don't have really that. We have a historical record because
Mm-hmm.
it's so close to us in history of the time period between Daniel and Jesus. But we don't have that
Mm-hmm.
in the biblical narrative really, at least not
Yeah.
in the
Okay, I see what you're
canonical
saying.
narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So, moving down to the last paragraph, starting in verse 15. Um, do you have anything you want to say about this? It's definitely sermon material because at the beginning, the king of Egypt says to the Hebrew midwives, like, oh, there's this midrash. Actually, it's really interesting. Um,
Hmm.
what happened was the king of Egypt was trying so hard to get them to not reproduce that he was working them until they're like to the bones of their fingers and that sort of stuff. And so they were working so long,
Yeah.
such long hours that they got home and they didn't have any energy to sleep with their wives. And so what the women did was they got these copper mirrors, did up their makeup and stuff, and in the middle of the day went over to their husbands when they were resting from their work in the middle of the day during their lunch hour, and they seduced them. And that is how Israel continued to multiply. Because although the king of Egypt wanted them to all not multiply because they'd be too tired in the evening, the women were like, well, if you're too tired in the evening, I'm coming to you in the day. And we're gonna get this done. So, they were
Yeah.
vigorous.
Yeah.
Um, and so
Yeah.
then he tries to get some Hebrew midwives involved. And that story actually is really interesting because it demonstrates how we are part of the spiritual world, but also part of this world specifically.
Mhm.
We are spiritual, physical beings. And the reason that it demonstrates that story is because the story actually is told about when God is constructing the tabernacle. And he tells Moses to build this basin using the copper mirrors that the women had. And Moses cries out to him. He's like, but the copper mirrors were designed for vanity. Why are you going to build this basin out of the copper mirrors? Like how does that work? You can't build something
Hmm.
holy out of this object of vanity. And God tells him that story and says, these mirrors are the reason why you guys continued to prosper as my people. And so it demonstrates the
Mm.
duplicity of our inhabitants in this world and the world to come.
Well, yeah, that's interesting, and
Yeah, yeah.
that's from the Midrash as well.
So
Yeah, I think on a much more basic level, because I don't have the amount of research in this that you do, but it's interesting that it basically says that God made them houses, and the evidence that he made them houses is that there's just this random section in the Bible that's dedicated to these two people, and they get named. There's so many people that go that do
Mm-hmm.
things in the Bible that go without being named, but they've been marked down for all of time,
Mm-hmm.
in God's word, because of what they did
Yeah,
saving His
yeah.
people, basically.
Shifra and Pua. Um, I wonder. So they're not in any genealogies that you can find.
I do
I'm
not
I'm
think
sure there's.
so. So that's another interesting thing. Yeah, I don't think that they're in any um genealogies. This is yeah, this is
Hmm.
looks to be the only
Yeah,
place
so
that they're
that's
mentioned.
interesting. Maybe there's a midrash about them specifically, but
Uh
what?
I here it is. They are the one rabbinic position is that they are Jochebed and
Oh,
Miriam.
interesting. There you go.
So so there you go. There you go. There you go. It's one of those Keturah
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hagar things.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So how Miriam was young.
Well,
I don't think
I
that one
mean
tracks.
that not necessarily. I mean I think that when I was growing up, there were adult Christians who thought that Isaac was
That's
young,
true.
because or at least they taught us that sort of thing in Sunday school. So there could be a lot of misconceptions. Miriam could have been, she could have been old enough,
I just
to
wonder
to
when Moses was born, how old
be
was
helping
Miriam?
out.
Because I'm pretty sure she was like
Uh-huh.
5 or something.
I don't know if there's actually something that would like be that specific
We'll get there.
about
We will
that,
get
but
there.
I, yeah, we'll get there. I think the main point, regardless of if it is Jochebed and Miriam or if it's Shifra and Pua, and they're just their own people, the point is, the people who help God's people are going to be blessed, and these people were exceedingly blessed. We will always
Mm-hmm.
remember them as
Mm-hmm.
righteous women, even though we don't say, "May your descendants be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, and Shifra and Pua,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
Jochebed and
Yeah,
Miriam."
no, they definitely are.
So
So
yeah.
that is the first thing. There's another midrash about actually Job, which is interesting because we do see Job in the genealogies in Egypt, and whether it's the same one or a different one, we don't know. But there's another midrash about how the king of Egypt, after this little episode with Shifra and Pua happens, he goes to his wise men and he
Mhm.
says, "I'm going to kill the people of Israel. I'm going to do this whole eugenics program, and I want your guys' advice." And there are 3 people. One of them is Job, and there are 2 others. I forgot their names, but each of them are biblical. One of them actually might be Amalek. But
Uh-huh.
they're let's assume it is Amalek. So Amalek says, "Good idea. You should do that." And so he is cursed forever. The other guy, the good guy, I think it's Moses' father, he says you should not do that. So he's blessed with Moses as a son. And then Job
Mm.
abstains. He just says nothing, which is bad. It's not a good thing. So this is sort of a
Yeah.
rabbinic explanation for why Job is put into the predicament he's in. I don't really buy it, but it's one of the interpretations. So then the king of Egypt begins this eugenics program because the midwives didn't work, and we're that's where the chapter ends. It's a cliffhanger. So,
Mm.
anything you want to add?
But I mean I do recall hearing about that midrash. I think from Pastor Mark or someone else. It's interesting, even if it's not true. It serves a purpose as a as a sort of lesson in morality and distinction between characters, because we know Amalek's evil and we know that we don't know much about Moses' father, so it sort of helps to add something there. So yeah, I don't know how much I would read into that, but yeah, Job sort of sticks out like a sore thumb. There was another thing. It's interesting that it basically calls him the Pharaoh. It calls him king for the first section, and through verse 10, and then when it starts in verse 11, it calls him Pharaoh for the rest of the time and doesn't call him king. So I thought that's sort of
Hmm.
interesting textually, and I'd be curious to know why that is, or if it's worth looking
Yeah, I'm
into.
not sure.
But I do think that I tend to be pretty fundamentalist on the idea. I think fundamentalist is the right word, on the idea that, everything like that in the Torah is there's a something to
Yeah.
parse out.
I think one of the lessons we can glean from this is eugenics is wrong. Don't do it. Especially,
Mm,
we have
yeah.
this in our own history with Margaret Thatcher. Not Margaret Thatcher. What was that girl's name? Sanger. Margaret Sanger. Yeah,
Margaret
Margaret
Sanger.
Thatcher. Yeah.
Yeah, the other Margaret. Margaret Thatcher, wrong country.
um, where she had this whole idea of undesirables. We should get rid of the undesirables by sterilizing the women and killing the babies. And Hitler did the same thing.
Yeah,
And of course, this Pharaoh is doing the exact same thing. He's saying, we don't want these
mm,
people around. We should. I mean, if you
yeah,
don't want these people around, there's only a few different options you can do. You can move away. That's not an option here. You can understand
yeah,
them, try to come to some sort of understanding. That Pharaoh obviously didn't want to do that. Or you can kill them. And that is obviously the choice that Pharaoh uh, decided to go with. And one thing
yeah,
we can know is whenever someone is a proponent of eugenics, they're in the wrong. Because eugenics itself is a
yeah,
horrible genocidal strategy. And if they are in the wrong in that way, probably the reason that they're doing it, the reason they've deemed one group of people as undesirables, that's also wrong. So with Margaret Sanger, she
yeah,
saw black people, poor people, the disabled as undesirable. And why is that wrong? Because you group all black people together and you're not supposed to do that. They're not grouped together. They are individuals
yeah,
within the larger group. And they're not all the same. You can't say black person and know everything
yeah,
about a black person, about that specific one. You can't group uh, poor people together because not all poor people are the same. They're not destined to remain poor. They're not destined to be a hamper or a sponge on society or anything. They are, they can
yeah,
form their own destiny, especially here in America. And disabled people, you can't group all disabled people as burdens. And seeing any
mm,
single person as a burden in general is a horrible thing to say. It's not loving your neighbor. It's the opposite of what God in the Bible and Jesus all promoted.
yeah. Well, and yeah, it goes back to Jesus, goes back to James. James says every trial that you go through is
Mm-hmm.
a good thing, because it's beneficial for the soul, basically, for the proving of character. And Jesus doesn't go up to the disabled people and say to his followers, guys, we should really just off these people. It's more merciful to them. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, he went and healed them. And the idea is like, why was this person? I believe it's in the text. It's like, why
Did
was he
he sin
disabled?
or did his parents sin?
And then the idea is
And
that,
Jesus says neither.
yeah, and then, yeah, he was here for this,
Mm-hmm.
for this miracle. And so even if there's a disabled person who never gets healed, it's
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason for it. There's a reason for all of the things on
Yeah.
on this earth, and so
And
that's
and
that's actually really
the
really
reason is
helpful
not to kill
and
them.
edifying.
And we see
Yeah.
this going on
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Canada right now
Well,
too.
yeah.
The whole assisted suicide thing. You call in for
uh,
depression, and they're like, "Have you tried suicide?" Or they call in for an infection in their leg, and they're like, "Suicide?" But
Yeah, it's terrible because that is I'd say just right there with divorce, in the sense that it's like that was never, ever, and never will be God's intention for someone to divorce. It's just because of the hardness of our hearts that we think of this evil evil solution, because death it is the
mm-hmm.
worst thing that exists. That was the
Yeah,
punishment from the Garden of Eden. That's the punishment for
it's
sin.
it's
It's the
it's a
worst
bit
thing that
worse than
exists.
divorce,
Why would
but
we?
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that divorce is like adultery is akin to idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
Divorce is akin to death, because the only the only real uh the
Yeah.
real divorce is death. That's divorce from God, and divorce from a person is essentially
Mm-hmm.
death to that person. Now we sort of changed that a little bit in our modern
One of
culture, but
the
that's how it is.
fundamental problems with this entire solution, this eugenics thing, is the idea that whatever person or whatever group of people is a burden. And if you get under that, you're like,
Mm,
okay, what does it mean for somebody to be a burden? It means that if it were not for them, we would all thrive. So if you get rid, so the whole idea of
mm,
getting rid of disabled people, they are a sponge on our resources. We get rid of them, frees up resources.
yeah,
We can do whatever program we want to do. Hitler and the Jews, they are the
yeah.
rich, powerful people that have essentially enslaved the Germans. Get rid of them. Germans can have their
Mm,
wonderful paradise. Black people in America, at least in the South, they are all poor. They are dumb, stupid, all that sort of stuff is what the Southerners would say. I know. I
Oh
had to,
man, be careful. There's clips on YouTube.
and that's wrong. You can't sterilize
Yeah.
or get rid of any sort of group of undesirables. And the reason that this is wrong is not just like, okay, maybe somebody is using resources and there's an unfair distribution there. So it's not their fault that you are not succeeding in whatever it is that you're wanting to
Mm,
succeed in. It's your fault. If you want to
yeah.
succeed, you do something about it. You can't say that if only it were not for Jews, if only it were not for black people, if only it were not for disabled people, if only it were not for the Israelites here in Egypt, then we would succeed. That's
Hmm.
not true. If it were not for you and your bad
Yeah.
choices, you would be succeeding. And
That's
it's
that's the.
personal
Oh, sorry. Go
responsibility.
ahead.
Either you're going to blame other people or you're going to blame yourself. If you blame other people, the only alternative is to get rid of them or educate them or do any sort of that sort of stuff. If you blame yourself, you can do something about it. Because if you blame other people, blaming other people alone is a moral failing. And then all of the stuff that follows blaming other people are also more severe moral failings. Blaming yourself
Mm,
is not a moral failing. That's called repentance. It's a moral good. And if you blame yourself, and you can, of course, not pathologically blame yourself so that you feel stuck and trapped and isolated, but take responsibility for your position in life, take responsibility for where you are, what you can do, what you will do in the future, and have a sort of optimism that with God's help, your position can change as long as you work hard and trust in the Lord. Then that leads to good. So many people,
Mm.
let's say born homeless, let's say born with a disability, let's say born without 3 limbs, let's say born in a particularly bad situation, or the underclass, or the lower level of the caste system, or whatever. If they take responsibility for themselves, they can succeed, whatever that looks like. Maybe everything isn't open to them, but that doesn't matter because everything being open to you isn't the definition of success. Especially as Christians, especially as people who believe the Bible, the definition of success for us is being obedient to the Lord and living a good life so that when we enter into heaven, He can say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That's success. Success isn't money. It's not 15 children or a supermodel wife or a degree or any of that sort of stuff. And it's idolatry to say otherwise. Success is
Hmm.
living a life that God can be proud of. Loving our neighbor, loving God, and fulfilling our duty, the mission that God has put us on earth to do. That's success. Anybody can achieve it. Not anybody can achieve material wealth, but anybody can achieve fulfilling their duty on earth.
Mm.
And I think that's I think that's the lesson
However,
we learn. And we see here that bitterness, the bitterness of the Egyptians, is what led to this sort of atrocity. Bitterness, and let's say the bitterness of the underclass, or so they perceived themselves to be, is what led to this atrocity. And it's a lesson for us because we are currently in the midst of defining the underclasses and the overclasses and trying to, quote, right that wrong. It's not going to work. It's going to lead to atrocities. Did you want to say something?
mm, yeah, we so basically we just have to focus on what we're doing mainly. And as soon as we start focusing on other people, that's
Mm-hmm.
it's a moral failing. So what I was just gonna say, the word for king is of course Melech that it uses for Pharaoh, and then once it starts using Pharaoh, the word Pharaoh means great house. Um, so they built for great house, treasure cities. So that's sort of understanding the words sort of makes it interesting. It makes
Mm-hmm.
me want to know more why it's used. And then Shifra and Pua. Shifra means fair, and Pua means uh,
Hmm.
splendid. And so that's sort of interesting when we talk about like anachronisms. Like
Mm-hmm.
naming the person because they did a great thing. It's a beautiful woman
Yeah.
and a splendid woman is like beautiful and splendid have houses now because
Well,
they were beautiful and splended. They
yeah.
they
And
treated God's
from a
people
narrative
good.
perspective, it also demonstrates like what is beauty. Well, beauty is what they did. What is fairness? What is
Yeah,
equity, so to speak? It's doing what they did. It's not
yeah.
doing whatever Pharaoh wanted.
Hmm. And then the I did have one more thing, which was reading the John, I believe it was John MacArthur. It might have been one of the other commentaries. It was John MacArthur. I'm fairly sure he was talking about how the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, or God hardening Pharaoh's heart, the word indicates twisting with a rope. And he continued saying that it was as if God was bringing Pharaoh to court and bearing basically
Mm-hmm.
his true intentions. Pharaoh wasn't able to lie about his true intentions before God, and so that's really what it meant is that when God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, he's he's making Pharaoh come to terms with or just be very clear about what Pharaoh already wants in his heart. And so that was really interesting reading that this morning. And that helps with the whole sort of free will determinism argument for me, because it's like, oh, okay, so God's not hardening, he's not like adding hardness to Pharaoh's heart, he's just making Pharaoh not lie, he's making Pharaoh be honest. And the reason this is relevant to the first chapter is because we see what at least this Pharaoh,
Mm-hmm.
his heart is, and presumably the next Pharaoh's heart is, the heart to euthanize, the heart to do eugenics, to kill off this population, or at least make them weak so that they can be subservient to him. Forcing them to be
Yeah.
subservient. It's a bad thing, and he passed it
Yeah.
on to the next
Well,
Pharaoh.
definitely there's a change of pharaohs when Moses is in the wilderness. So this pharaoh dies, and the next
Yeah.
pharaoh comes, Moses' brother, and adopted brother. And one of the interesting
Right.
things that can come from that sort of transition is the idea of, well, I'm not as bad as my father was. I'm not that bad. I'm actually pretty good.
Mm.
All I'm doing is enslaving you. I'm not killing all your babies. I'm letting you live. I'm good. I'm a good guy. And then Moses comes
Yeah.
in and is like, let my people go
Yeah.
then, if you're a good guy. And Pharaoh's like, no. The
Right.
hardening of his heart is, like you said, the bearing of his true intentions. He's not the good guy that will listen to the word of the Lord and free the people who God says to free. It's time for them to be freed. And so he is lifting himself up, he's exalting himself, and he's continuing to keep his boot on their backs.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, especially when you think when you're reading it, and it's like this Pharaoh. It states in, I believe, the next chapter that we'll get into. No spoilers, but that this
Yeah.
Pharaoh wanted
Well,
to
it's
kill
also
him. Well,
interesting too.
just
Is right before
so.
the institution of the 10th plague, the Pharaoh says, "If you
Mm,
see me again, if you see my face again, you will die." And so the idea is like, I'm not a
yeah.
murderer like my dad was. God's like, that is the true intention of your heart. You will, amidst the destruction of
Uh-huh.
your entire people, you will keep them enslaved, and you will even kill
Mm,
to get what you want, as opposed to doing the
mm.
thing that is best, which is, and good and righteous, which is to listen to God and free the Israelites.
Yeah. I thought I remembered a midrash, or some sort of rabbinical source. Probably again heard it from Pastor Mark. Um, that basically the Jews consider Pharaoh, they like just straight face
Mm-hmm.
say he is a murderer, um, because of what he did. And I don't think that comes through when we read the biblical narrative as much. But like when you think about it, it's like he's actually just a murderer. Like he knew exactly what was going to
Mm-hmm.
happen from the beginning, that all of these children were going to die, and he
Mm-hmm.
let it happen anyways. Yeah.
Well,
So just that just shows the character of Pharaoh. He knew it was going to happen, and he just let it happen, like you said, despite the
mm-hmm.
damage to his own people. He had just had
With
that
that
massive
said,
amount
we
of
should
pride.
close out.
So
If you have any questions, comments, or
yeah,
concerns, feel free to post them down below. Anything you want to say?
have a good week, everybody.
Bye.
Shavua Tov, Shabbat Shalom.